Bob Murphy Show, episode 492.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. Another crossover. This time, we've got two main things for you. First, Adam is going to relay to me a listener question about the petrodollar. So we get all into that, explain the basics and some of the nuances. And then we go through, I recently was on a ZeroHedge debate pitted against Randall, Wray, who's one of the developers of modern monetary theory, or MMT. But it really, I mean, there was some clash, but the moderator didn't want it to be a debate per se. He said, you know what, I want to just go through a bunch of topics, many of which had financial implications for the ZeroHedge audience. And I just want to hear, Bob, you as an Austrian, how do you look at this stuff? And Randy, you as an MMTer, how do you look at this stuff? And that's what we did. So Adam watched the whole thing, grabbed, I think, 6 clips that he found interesting and wanted, me to elaborate on. So that's what this episode consists of. And I think you'll like it. Here we go.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
And hello, ladies and gentlemen. Forgive me, one and all. I'm coming off of a cold, and I might cough from time to time here, so I hope that doesn't bother anybody. Bob, good to see you again.
Nice
what's
to
new?
see you. There's progress in the non-war in the Middle East.
What are they calling it? A military thingamabob? Is that the official?
I don't know, but I know it's going very well.
It's
There
going
it is.
so well, and it could go even better. So we have a listener, viewer, subscriber question that's related to the conflict in the Middle East and economics, and I'm going to run it by you if that's all right.
Sure thing.
All right. The question involves what the petrodollar is and what its effects are on prices here domestically in the U.S. and what would happen if it went away. And the phrasing of the question, I'll just say it as written, just in case there's some nuance in there. The listener says, I know oil has to be purchased in U.S. dollars. Entities buy U.S. dollars to buy oil, increasing the demand for dollars. But unless it's soaked up by treasuries or maybe U.S. equities, how are all those U.S. dollars hiding out and not causing prices to rise in the U.S.? Because at some point, somebody's going to buy something from the U.S., right? The folks who just sold the oil will sell their U.S. dollars newly acquired back for something from the United States or convert them just into their own currency. So how does that petrodollar impact prices, and what happens? And include the scale, Bob, if you can. What happens if all of a sudden they start using some other type of unit and don't increase their demand for dollars just to have these transactions?
Okay, so great question. And over the years, I've been thinking about this as a typical thing that comes up, particularly in Austro-libertarian circles that are, not fans of the U.S. dollar, not fans of U.S. foreign policy. And so this is ripe fodder for discussion. So I'm going to, try to get to the broad framework and give people a way to get their hands around this. But let me just point out the way that question was worded. I think there was a tension within it, and the questioner was saying that, hey, if whatever, Saudi Arabia just sells its oil to Japan or somebody for dollars, and then if Saudi Arabia doesn't put it into treasuries or something, but instead just spends the money on goods, U.S. goods, then how does that do anything? Wouldn't that just cause prices to rise here at home? And I'll say, okay, but by the same token, even if they bought treasuries, still the dollars come to the United States, to the U.S. government or to whoever that sold them the treasuries, right? And so I'm saying if ultimately you're saying won't all dollars find their way back to the United States and push up prices, yes, But then that's why the timing does matter. All right. And so at any given moment, if you can, if you're an issuer of dollars, then to the extent that you can get other members of the world to hold them in their cash balances, at least temporarily,
Right.
then that does give you some leeway, right? Where you can create new dollars, get goodies with them. And then to the extent that other people hold that, there's a lag there. And so right, it's not infinite. If you could somehow convince foreigners to just, put the $100 bills up as, frame them and hang them in their house as art, that would be the best thing. If you could just do
Right.
that, and their appetite for that was unquenchable, then yeah, that would be great. But that's clearly not what's going to happen. And so I'm saying that, so clearly the time element does matter, because ultimately, yeah, every dollar you could argue is going to find its way back, because even if people are buying stocks or bonds or whatever, you could keep pushing it and say, well, the person that's issuing the stocks or the bonds, why do they want dollars for those? Because they're going to spend them. And even if they invest in a factory or something, still, you get the point that ultimately everything at some point is going to find its way into a consumer's hand who's going to buy eggs. And then you could say, so see, in the long run, it's going to push up egg prices. All right. So that's, one thing. It's not that what the person asked was wrong. I'm just saying it seemed like they were setting this false dichotomy that, ultimately it's going to push up prices unless it takes a detour through treasuries. And I want to say, well, no, at best, that's just, an extra leg in the transaction and the round trip. Okay. So then as far as like, but the bigger picture and like, is this an issue? And so, I'll try to be brief, because folks, we are, getting to other clips here from the recent ZeroHedge debate that I had. I have always found it, there's a lot of people that say, oh yeah, the stuff with the petrodollar, and it has to, you can really understand U.S. foreign policy with this. And a lot of times they don't quite nail the landing, as it were. Like, to me, as a theoretical economist, like when they just explain what their theory is, it doesn't make sense to me. And here, let me just give you an example of what I mean. So here, I just Googled petrodollar, and it comes up on the AI overview. And it says the petrodollar system is the global practice of pricing and settling oil transactions exclusively in U.S. dollars, established in the early 1970s following an agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. This system compels nations to hold large reserves of U.S. currency to purchase energy, reinforcing the dollar's role as the world's dominant reserve currency. The surplus dollars earned by oil exporting countries are often, quote, recycled back into the U.S. economy, particularly through the purchase of U.S. Treasury bonds, which helps finance U.S. government debt. And then here's the big thing. The bullet point says, following the collapse of the Bretton Woods gold standard, the U.S. brokered a deal where Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, and then here's the money part, no pun intended, and invest the proceeds into U.S. financial assets in exchange for military protection and advanced weaponry. Okay, and by the way, this AI thing I think was drawing heavily, I could just tell. Scott Bayer, Beyer, at the Independent Institute had a thing that came out in February of this year called Unpacking the Petrodollar War Theory. And he goes through and, there's things where, well, gee, like Gaddafi and Saddam and some other characters that didn't fare so well against the U.S. war machine, we're talking about, maybe pricing, maybe we're going to price it in other things besides the dollars, and look what happened to them. Okay, so my narrow point, Adam, is that it's important what they said there in terms of the, in Scott's article, I'll read it, he put it this way. In 74, the U.S. reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia. Saudi oil would be priced and sold in U.S. dollars, and in return, the U.S. would provide security guarantees and access to American financial markets, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, oil exporters then reinvested those dollars into U.S. Treasury bonds and financial assets, a process called petrodollar recycling. So what I want to say is that second part is critical, right? So the mere fact that they, if Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries, starting in the 70s with this system, said, all right, anybody who wants to buy oil from us, you have to actually pay us in U.S. dollars. That's a requirement we have. If that were the end of it, and then they got the U.S. dollars and they said, well, what do we want to do with these things? And they said, well, I really want to get into Japanese assets. And so then they took the US dollars and bought yen with it and then bought Japanese government bonds or real estate in Tokyo or whatever. Then that wouldn't be as significant as what in fact they did is they took the US dollars and went and bought treasuries and or buying US weapons, right? And so on the flip side, you could imagine it in the mirror image where they never agreed to sell it in US dollars, but what they did agree with the US was a big chunk of our oil revenue, we're going to use it to buy U.S. treasuries and weapons from Lockheed and whatnot. And so they sell it in yen, and when the euro existed in euros and whatever else, Chinese yuan. And then so what do you do now with all this, this Japanese yen that you accumulated because you're selling your oil in yen? Well, then we want to go buy U.S. treasuries. So what do? You take the yen and you go switch it for dollars. And you see what I'm saying? So there's two separate things going on, and I think both of those are important to understand the historical importance of the petrodollar system and how it benefited the United States for this system to be up and running. That again, it wasn't merely the sort of temporary thing of, yes, their sales are formally conducted in our currency, but then they can go do what they want. It's also then, and they agree that the bulk of their revenues they're going to then devote into U.S. assets. And so I think both, kind of move hand in hand. And so last thing I'll say here is in and of itself, the mere insistence on oil sales being denominated in U.S. dollars, and even if that's what they actually took in currency, right? Because there's a distinction to be made. It's one thing to say it's priced in U.S. dollars versus the sale is conducted in it, right? In other words, you could pay somebody in some other currency, but just the official price tag is measured in U.S. dollars, and so you use whatever the spot exchange rate is, right? So even there, there's a distinction in terms of what exactly do you mean by that. But I'm saying even go full hog and say, no, it's not only is it priced in U.S. dollars, which per se doesn't mean too much, but even they insist on payment still at any given time because, like I said, everybody could be exchanging. If that's all it required, then that per se, it means other things equal, more U.S. dollars would be held abroad and, bank balances and whatever than would otherwise be the case. But in the grand scheme, how much, the most it would mean is that the U.S. had a one-shot thing where they could print up some money, export it for cars or whatever, and then never have to pay for it, right? And foreigners just sat on those, you can think of it as literally $100 bills if you want. You get me? Because they would never recycle. But no, we have to hold them because they just keep going around the system in terms of, needed for oil sales ultimately because Saudi Arabia and everybody else is insisting on getting actual U.S. dollars. Okay, but that would kind of be a one-shot thing, and then as the economy grew over time and the sales grew, measured in dollar terms, we could print some more to keep augmenting it. But you get the idea that that's in and of itself, or if they collapsed it, how much are we talking about? I don't think it's that big a number in the grand scheme that would then, chickens coming home to roost and would push up prices here. I don't think it's that big a component of our overall, M2 money stock or something. Okay. So, but last thing, sorry. And it was good because literally today I was watching Jeffrey Sachs was on Judge Napolitano's show, and amongst other things, he asked him about the petrodollar stuff, and Sachs agreed with me on that narrow point. He's like, yeah, I don't think technically it's that big of a deal. And I think what we're doing there is kind of like saying perhaps if, there's some dictator and some teenage kid, in the middle of the night takes out his can of spray paint and on an overpass says, the dictator's regime will fall. He's a monster. And on one hand, you could say, does that threaten the dictator? And you say, well, no, he's got a bunch of tanks and stuff. What the heck? But on the other hand, he makes sure to scrub that. And if he catches the kid doing it, he's going to kill him. Because the idea is if your power rests on public expectations and a perception of hopelessness or futility or whatever, you got to nip that in the bud. So I think that's kind of where we are, that the US dollar being the global reserve currency is largely just inertia. And well, that's because kind of how it is. And there's network effects and stuff like that. So any one little thing isn't a big deal. But I can buy into the story of if some guy's mouthing off and saying, we're going to price our oil, in something else, the U.S. feels we got to make an example of him because we can't have other people doing this. So I think that's kind of, so I'm being a good economist here, and no matter what happens, I'm right.
Of course.
But I hope I'm at least trying to get across like the flavor of what the framework is.
Well, let me tell you about the way I was thinking about it, and you could, as an analogy, and you can just tell me how wrong that is.
Okay.
I was thinking that however many dollars are in existence at any given moment, if they were just bouncing around the domestic economy, the price level would be one thing. But if 20 or 30% of those are circulating elsewhere in the world for whatever reasons, facilitating oil transactions, Argentinians holding them so they can facilitate transactions amongst themselves, if that's the case, then our price level here domestically will be that much lower because those dollars are being used elsewhere, so they're not being used to bid up prices here. So think of it like like a circulatory system or something like that.
Yeah. What are you, Epstein?
Think of the human body, Bob. Your doctor doesn't know.
Yeah.
So I mean, is that a wrong way to look at it?
No, that's entirely right. The only quibble I would say, and this, I didn't have this complication in my original thing too. Like, no, what you just said is totally consistent with the second of 5 points I just made or whatever.
Okay.
The quibble though is like, as a first pass, thinking of it as like $100 bills or something, but in reality, this is the Eurodollar system, right? That there's a lot of things that have some kind of name and then dollar at the end. Is that a lot of the dollars that foreigners use, it's not actual $100 bills that now it's not in the U.S. pushing up prices because it went abroad and we got a Toyota for it and we didn't have to give anything in exchange. We just sent them green piece of paper. That really it's the banks over there like multiply their deposits electronically on the basis of a very narrow reserves consisting of actual U.S. currency, or they have reserves of J.P. Morgan. They have a checking account with J.P. Morgan, which is in literal dollars, whereas over there, you get the point. So I think there is like an accordion effect where if the foreign demand for dollars increases, a lot of that supply isn't coming from sucking dollars out of the U.S. that makes prices lower here without, not hurting us because, we're getting goods and services for it. But yeah, it does mean some U.S. dollars flow abroad to serve as like the reserves, but then European banks can pyramid on top of that. And so a lot of the quote dollars that are being paid to Saudi Arabia and the other OPEC countries were loaned into existence through the push of a keypad by European banks or other foreign banks too. So everything you said is right, but I'm just saying quantitatively, it might be if the foreign demand for dollars drops 50%, it might not be like, so if we went and quantified the total volume of dollars spent on oil, would half of that then show up tomorrow in the U.S.? And then if you multiplied by the domestic currency in the U.S., would prices go up that proportionally? I think that's way overstating what would happen, because I think the drop in demand would, like a lot of the drop in the supply would just be because loans would get paid off, and then the outstanding created dollars by the foreign banks would shrink.
Oh, interesting. Do you have any intuition? Like, let's say the petrodollar just wasn't a thing tomorrow. Do you have any idea what the magnitude impact on prices here in the U.S. generally would be?
6.8 to 7.3%.
That's not nearly enough decimal places for.
Off the top, I don't think it would be more than a 10% one shot. But again, I think the reason that would be a big deal, though, is the circumstances under which that happened might then make everybody around the world say, whoa, we don't want dollars either.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I think there's a lot of people sitting on dollars right now because they know, the fundamentals aren't sound. Like, they're running, U.S. debt to GDP ratio is broken 100%. And it seems like any time there's a problem, the Fed just does QE and whatever. But up till now, he says, so how come, interest rates aren't 12% in the United States? It's because, it's the dollar. What else are you going to do? Where else are you going to go?
Wiley hasn't looked down yet,
right.
so everything's fine.
I think that's kind of the issue, that if you were analyzing that, that means you're already in the scenario where everybody's getting out of the dollar, in which case it's going to fall a lot more than what I just said.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you, listener. That was fascinating. Bob, you just had a very interesting ZeroHedge debate with a feller named Professor Randall Wray. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, your general impressions of how you think it went. And then I pulled a bunch of clips and I wanted to use them to ask you more questions.
Yeah. So the host, Kevin, I think Muir, he told me there was a funny thing, like there's some California something or other that his name is the same as like a wildlife foundation or something like that, forestry. And, but I don't live in California, so I don't know what he's talking about. So the mnemonic failed in this case. And, so anyway, he had told us before, so Randall Wray, folks, is a big MMT guy. He's, one of the creators of modern MMT. And, the host, he said, you know what? I don't think they want to debate between economists from different schools. I think a lot of the people, who read ZeroHedge, they want to know help, have help in navigating markets and things like that. How do I make sense of the news and translate that into my portfolio decisions? So what we were doing was not so much trying to defeat each other in battle, but rather he was bringing up a lot of issues that had financial implications and then asking, okay, what does an Austrian say? What does an MMTer say? Right. That was kind of the deal. So I liked that approach. And I think it was good. As I put it, we're not trying to beat the other guy. It's we're giving the viewers a menu, like a buffet of options, and just say, here, which dish would you like to sample?
Yeah, I thought it was good too. Let me start with the first clip. It's of your interlocutor just describing his own economic viewpoint, and it brought up a question. So let me play for you.
Hopefully you and other viewers here think that I'm an MMTer, which actually is kind of funny because I'm one of the creators of MMT, but I'm not an MMTer. I'm a Keynesian. I'm a student of Minsky, as you said. I'm a Minskian. I'm an institutionalist economist. I'm a Veblenian, and I studied Marx too. And out of maybe 500 academic publications, a very small percent of them are MMT. Okay. I agree with much of what Bob said. I want to do real world economics. I'm not interested in really simplistic, silly mathematical models that are just designed to obscure the fact that the economist has no idea what they're talking about. I'm completely dismissive of all the mainstream economists. So anyway, that's how I got here. I work in a paradigm called monetary theory of production, and all of the great heterodox schools of thought, which means the ones that are not mainstream, Keynesian, institutionalist, and Marxist, work within this same paradigm, which means that we believe that the capitalist economy, production takes the form of you start with money to produce commodities to sell for more money.
You start with money to produce commodities to sell for more money. Also, Marxism, Keynesianism, and whatever Veblenianism. Is that a person? Veblenianism?
Yeah, Veblen.
Yeah, so I was confused by all that. I was wondering how much light you could shed.
Okay, so I was surprised at, at the beginning when he said, I'm not an MMTer. At first I was thinking, like, what are we doing in this debate then, right? Because some of the backstory, I won't say who, but originally it was supposed to be a narrow debate on a federal job guarantee. And that's a standard like a lot of the MMT people are for that. And we know we can afford it, right? Because, you're not constrained. If there's unemployed people, putting them to work doesn't cost anything. But that guy couldn't do it. And so then we got a replacement. And then, the monitor wanted to expand it. And ironically, we never even covered job guarantee. But so there I was surprised. But then the more he talked, there's two possibilities. One is he just means like, well, no, I was formed as an economist with these other, preceding influences. And then, yeah, I helped create what we now think of as the MMT framework, but that doesn't make me an MMTer because I came before. You get what I'm saying? Like, so maybe he just means it sort of like as a tautology. How can I be an MMTer when I created it? Like, is the son greater than the father kind of thing? I didn't know if he meant that or if he even meant like more like no, man, I'm so much beyond that. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you peasants, you do the little things that we do, but I mean, there's so much more to the world than just the accounting tautologies and MMT. So I don't know what he meant. So it could have been one of the two. Okay.
Bob, before we continue, I want to have a completely natural, totally spontaneous discussion about how awesome the new Scott Horton Academy is and why everybody listening should go to scotthortonacademy.com/crossover and immediately sign up for it.
Exactly, folks. I knew I was going to like it. After all, I've liked Scott. I've interviewed him on my show several times. I've seen him in long-form interviews like on Tucker Carlson. And I just thought, oh, this will just be like that, but more so. And it is that, but it's even better. Just to give you an example, like Scott goes through a presentation and he's got multimedia. Like you can see the video of Saddam Hussein calling off names and having people taken out back. And I don't think they were given a retirement package. I don't know exactly what happened. I don't speak the language, but it didn't look too good for them. And lots of stuff like clips of Jimmy Carter praising the Shah of Iran, just all kinds of stuff like that, really helping you to understand how the heck did we get into this mess. And so I know it sounds like I'm just saying this for the ad, but it really is true that I'm not going to watch a movie or something later on. I'm going to get back to listen to Scott explain what the heck happened with U.S. foreign policy. So I can't recommend it enough.
Awesome. Remember, folks, go to scotthortonacademy.com/crossover and you will get a great discount, and Bob and I will get a kickback, so you will be supporting these crossover episodes.
But again, like he has like a leading textbook on like how I developed, I forget the title, but it's, in there he's saying I helped create it. So to me, it would be like if Mises said, I'm not an Austrian economist. And, or I guess maybe Menger could say that, I don't know. So anyway, I don't know how exactly he meant that. It did surprise me. As far as the other thing, I know that sounds funny. And Piero Sraffa has a thing called the production of commodities by means of commodities. And so I don't know if what Wray is talking about is like a generalization of that. But I think, to be fair, the people are like, well, of course, what are we talking about? Standard mainstream models don't have money in them. And like, again, the workhorse model when I was at NYU, like you could go either way. If you were in a micro class, then yeah, you could have a multiplicity of agents and, N commodities and blah, 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 and all this stuff. But everybody knew everything. And you could define an equilibrium as, it's a vector of exchange ratios, but they're all barter exchange ratios. You didn't need money. Everybody knew everything in the model. Or if it was macro, it would be ludicrously simple. And it would be, there's one household who has a utility function and he lives forever. And there's one firm. And if you're lucky, there's a central bank. And you might say, well, surely the central bank issues money. And you say, yeah. And they have to like force people to hold it. Like you just directly put it in the utility function. Like, you get utility from holding money the way you would from holding a Picasso, right? Because again, there's no reason to hold money in these models. So I think maybe what he's getting at is we from the ground up, our approach understands that people do stuff for money and blah, blah, blah. And that's what gives rise. And they do think they have an insight into, where's money. Like one last thing, just because it's so relevant. I promise I'll let you talk, Adam. The going around recently on Twitter was the Milton Friedman thing. I'm sure you've seen it where he's like, you got to remember where the government doesn't have any money. They took it from you. That's where the government gets its money, from what they took from you, right? It's famous and, yeah, get him, Milton. And then like some MMTers got their hands on that and they're just laughing, hysterically. Like, what are you talking about? No, any money you got came from the government. Just take it out of your wallet and look at it, right? It came from the government. So what are you talking about, you idiots? And they're both kind of right. You know what I mean? Like you can see, what Friedman means and what they mean. So anyway, I hope that's enough context just to show that even though prima facie that sounded ludicrous on his part, that is just how stunted and sterile like the mathematical mainstream is that he's recoiling against.
I get it. And this leads perfectly into the next clip. It's awkward, Bob, but I'm going to play a clip of you.
All right.
And have you respond to it while I ask you a question.
At least I had a different shirt on. I was just like, oh my God, did I wear the same? No, I dressed up for the ZeroHedge debate. I put on a long sleeve shirt.
Yeah, that would have been bad. Yeah, and then I'm going to ask you a super childish question that I know I've asked you before, but I can't help it. So
okay,
be prepared.
I'm of the perspective, again, coming from a free market point of view, that just like if, geez, what's the problem with central planning? And should there be a group of government experts that determines how many grocery stores there are or determines what wheat prices or oil prices should be? Most free market economists would say, no, that's crazy. And they said, well, hey, Murphy, what do you think the right price of oil should be? I said, I don't know. Let the market decide. It's then to say, hey, do you think the Fed should raise or lower rates? It's not that I disagree with their choice. It's that this whole institutional framework to me is crazy. All right. And so but more specifically in the Austrian paradigm, going back to what I said earlier about their particular theory of the boom bust cycle, very quickly, I'll say the Austrians think that interest rates have a job to do, just like the price of oil means something, the price of, unskilled labor in Minneapolis means something, and so forth, that the Austrian view, the various maturities and interest rates, that if it were in a genuine market economy, balancing, the views of people, lenders and borrowers and so forth, those numbers actually refer to something. And for the government to come in via the central bank and lower interest rates, the conventional view is like, oh, well, that might cause too much inflation. But no, like in the Austrian, no, it causes an unsustainable boom, among other things, right? So in the Austrian paradigm, which has this rich, I'm going to use some $10 words, intertemporal capital structure, like you can at least tell the story.
Someone wrote an PhD on that, right?
Yeah. There could be a boom bust cycle. So I'm saying, last point I'll just make here is that was some of my frustration in grad school, like talking to my, the guys going through my cohort who were getting, their PhD in economics and from NYU, which was a decent school. It wasn't that they disagreed. Like they couldn't even tell the Austrian story in their framework. It wasn't even possible for there to be malinvestment in the sense of what the Austrians mean by that term. So again, it's ironic because again, the usual knock against the Austrians is, oh, you guys are like medieval scholastics. We got our rigorous models. And it was like, no, actually our story of the business cycle is too complicated for let's assume there's one household that lives forever and that there's a capital stock K subscript T. Like you can't even tell the Austrian story. So maybe we're wrong, but the point is like the mainstream competitors can't even comprehend the complexity of the story we're telling.
So that all seems...
I feel like Ralphie in the Christmas Story. Wow, that's great.
It is great. It is great. I'm nodding in my head. I'm going, yeah.
Captivated. Go ahead. Sorry.
It's exactly right. It seems so obvious and so true. And yet mainstreamers think we're the goofballs, think you're the goofball. And my 5-year-old childish question is why are they acting like that? What can they possibly be thinking to say, no, we're right. It is just capital is all just K, and you're silly for even thinking there's a structure over time of the stages of production. How can they even defend their position? Surely they say something semi-intelligent.
Yeah. So some might say what you just said, but I think the more sophisticated ones would say, yes, I'll keep it brief. I tell you exactly what they would say. Like if I want to pretend to be them, they say, yes, of course, we know our models are unrealistic, but we have, a model that's quite realistic. It's the real world, and that's too complicated. There's too many moving parts. We don't understand it. And so how can we approach understanding that? Well, we start with a very simple model, and we study that thing and put it through its paces, and then we add one more layer of complexity and so on. And that, yes, the current state of macroeconomics and business cycle modeling, we're kind of approaching it from two different ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, we're starting with very simple assumptions. Yep, one household, one firm, no government, whatever. And we start building it up from there. But we can also leapfrog to the other end where we have what's called an Arrow-Debreu model, where we have an infinite dimensional space, or maybe it's finite but a humongous number of goods and services available at any time. And then going forward, for an arbitrary length of time, and you can specify any kind of contract to say, yes, deliver me good J, 2 units of it at time period T plus, I, and under this realization of some shock, so we can have uncertainty in there and everything and possible future states of the world. We can do all that and have all the prices, at this time and whatever, and optimize. So we can do that. It's just, Murphy, that, we can be very clear and explore all the equilibria and everything from the real simple model, or we can state abstractly that, the complicated Arrow de Breu thing that could encompass just about anything, where, you can tell almost any story you want. And we're just trying to bring those two ends closer together. Whereas what you guys are doing is you're camped out in the middle somewhere. Like your story of the, the Hayekian thing, or this Roger Garrison character who recently passed away, it's not like his model was true. He had 5 stages. You think the economy just consists of a triangle and 5? Give me a break, you guys. So you're, unrealistic too. It's not like your model is nailing it, and yet you have no rigor. Whereas at least our models on either end of the spectrum, are down, the T's are crossed and I's are dotted, and it's mathematically rigorous. So there you go, punk. So we're at MIT and you're not. So that's what they would say.
So they have mathematical rigor on their nonsense, whereas we are explaining what's actually going on.
That's not a paraphrase of what I just said.
That's what I heard. All right, I'm going to give up. You know how I feel about this.
But so I will say, because I recently had Alberto Bazzine on my show, and he was going through, and he was trying to say, well, no, with the capitals, like we can do it now, like with the multiplicity of capital goods and everything. And this is what the last thing I'll say. He's not wrong that, yes, in principle, they have models that are real complicated, and it's not like what I said there would be a straw man to say, oh, come on, it's not just like big K with a subscript T. They have more sophisticated models. But that's not how they think about it. When they think of what's the interest rate, they say it's the marginal product of capital. They say you put epsilon more of capital in the production function, how much does total output go up? And then that, the real interest rate is equal to that in equilibrium. And I'm just saying that's wrong. It's not the right way to think about it. Just like I think we got into it last time, Adam, about you could tell a similar story. So if you just add one more robot, then how much, does productivity? And so that's what the real wage rate is equal to. And you can see how and no, that's not, So anyway, even though, yes, formally they can handle that stuff, I think deep down when they think about, economic principles and whatnot, not a specific model, that they just internalize the wrong lessons because they start out with, the wrong fable. Whereas, we have our fables too, or whatever you want to call it, but I think ours are more useful.
All righty. Next clip I want to play. You guys are talking about the financial crisis in 2008 and the fact that Bernanke didn't even tell Congress where the money went when they started doing all their shenanigans. And then Randall Wray said this.
He told Congress, no, I'm not going to tell you. Bloomberg sued him, Freedom of Information Act. He finally agreed to release the data. It was 29,000 pages of data. At the Levy Institute, we had 2 of my graduate students go through the data and total it up. It turned out it was $29 trillion. That's what the Fed did during the financial crisis. $29 trillion of spending and lending. That's what it took to save the financial system.
So there's a couple of questions I could ask. The first is, do you think you got that number right?
Here, I'm just pulling up something. This total. I think this is what I want. Yeah, this looks right. So, in terms of total assets, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet was like $850 billion-ish going into the crisis. And then it rapidly increased to $2 trillion and change, by 2010. And then it went up a little bit. And as of right now, it peaked at $9 trillion and then started coming down. Okay. So, the 29 trillion, because he said spending and lending. So the only way that could be true, and I'm not saying it isn't, but what he could mean by that and would have to mean is that when the Fed like had all these windows open, you know, short-term liquidity and things like that, and a company comes and posts its troubled assets and then gets a loan and they go do something with it and they have 30 days to roll it over, that they were viewing like, so, you know, some bank comes, pledges its mortgage-backed securities or whatever, credit default swaps, whatnot. The Fed creates $1 billion out of thin air, gives it to them, they go do something with it and pay them back. And then the next month, the Fed does the same thing with some other borrower and does that 12 times in a row. They would count that as $12 billion in lending. Whereas at any given time, there was only a new billion that had been created and was, you know, in the hands of somebody else. So do you see the distinction I'm drawing there?
I think so, yeah.
So that's, so
the
yeah.
extra 27 trillion just gets netted out in the wash or something?
Well, no, I'm saying the Fed did create like 2 trillion, 3 trillion, depending on what time frame you're looking at, in terms of new reserves that they pump, you know, they bought assets and pumped that into the system and also, you know, could have been lending it. But I'm saying to get, so how does 2 or 3 trillion of newly created assets, you know, reserves, how does that turn into 29? I'm saying they must be counting it as they give somebody a short-term loan and then that person pays it back and then they relend it. So I'm saying they're counting every cycle, every turn of that.
Okay.
Which isn't wrong. I'm just saying that people might be it's not that they created 29 trillion new dollars and said, here you go, everybody. And then, oh, that's why things got so expensive. That no, they created like 3 trillion more in reserves and just kept short-term, you know, rolling it over to people as they needed it.
Gotcha. All right, I'm going to save my second question for this next clip then, because it involves the big distinction Wray makes between fiscal policy and monetary policy when trying to handle these crises. So here we go.
Congress would only give $800 billion. They're worried about the deficit. Now contrast that to COVID. COVID, we lost 22 million jobs, 22 million people. And plus, you know, even those of us who didn't lose our jobs, we couldn't leave the house, okay? Which meant, you know, the service sector is completely wiped out. If Amazon couldn't deliver it to your house, you didn't get it. What did we do? Well, Biden spent $2 trillion, mailed out checks, okay, and then added the Inflation Act after that, and Trump comes in and mails some more checks, okay? We recovered in 2 months, and we recovered all of those jobs in 2.5 years. That's the difference that fiscal policy makes. You solve a crash with fiscal policy, you unwind the financial institutions, you shut them down, you sell them off, you do what Roosevelt did in the Great Depression.
So there's a lot there. He's describing the difference between how, quote unquote, we handled 2008 and then how we handled COVID. And he was a big fan of the checks that Biden sent out, fiscal stimulus. For some reason, he didn't like so much when Trump did it. Might be a political bias or something. But what did you think when he said that? I didn't understand. It's probably obvious to you, but I didn't understand why he thought the monetary solution was wrong, but the fiscal one is right.
Okay, so a lot there. Let me just mention before I forget, I hadn't thought through it. I mean, just because, you know, I'm jotting down notes and trying to figure out what am I going to say when it's my turn. The thing there at the end was kind of ironic where he, you know, he's trying to show, now the way to really get this correct is like, look at what FDR did. And I was like, right. And that's why, you know, we nipped that Great Depression in the bud in 1933 and the economy was fine. So at that point, you know, it's funny how, you know, but no, he was on the right track. He just should have done more. So for folks at home, the distinction between fiscal and monetary policy, the stuff the central bank does is monetary policy, and the federal government, particularly, it's, you know, the deficits, like, you know, spending more than it takes in tax receipts, that's called fiscal policy. All right. And so just to make sure people understand his claim, he was saying following the '08 crisis, the Federal Reserve certainly did a lot. They had all the rounds of QE. People were freaking out. And to his credit, he could have, accused me there and said, yeah, and maybe he just didn't know that I was concerned about price inflation after the rounds of QE that didn't materialize. But he didn't. Right. So there's that. And then Obama did come in with his stimulus package. I think it was called the affordable, just the ARRA, I think. I can't remember what those letters stood for. Recovery and something Act. And so there was a big deficit. It was like $850 billion or something stimulus package. I know that they said at the time they didn't want it to exceed $1 trillion because that would be too scary and the Republicans would pounce, but they needed it to be big enough to make it look like this is going to do something, right? So that was partly the logic behind whatever number they landed at, 850 billion ish. And whereas with COVID, the deficits were bigger and also the Fed did more too. So that's another thing that's weird about his. He's saying it's clearly the fact that the fiscal policy was bigger. Yeah, but what the Fed did was bigger under COVID too. So even on his own terms, this wasn't a clean-cut experiment to contrast fiscal versus monetary expansion.
Yeah.
But anyway, so his point was, we had the crappy, lackluster recovery under Obama, whereas the COVID, we, restored those jobs really fast. Yeah, we got some inflation, but I mean, what do you expect? So that's the argument he's making. And so my primary response was to say, no, the reason I would argue that we got all those, we turned things around like within 2 months during COVID was that we didn't have a normal recession. The reason we lost, whatever he said, 20 million jobs or whatever, did he say 20 or 2? I forget what he said, is that the government said you can't leave your house.
Yeah.
So that's why all those people lost their jobs.
Made your jobs illegal.
Right. And then when the government said, okay, you can go back to work now, that's where everyone went back to work.
It's the darndest thing. All those jobs just came right back.
Right. So that, he was said 20 million. I'm just doing the math. Right. So there's that element. And then, okay. So that's my primary response. And then, like I said, it didn't occur to me at the time, and I'm just unpacking here with you, Adam. Also, it's not clear why is COVID a fiscal, attack, not a monetary one, when if you look at a chart of what the Fed did, it was way bigger, during COVID than it was after the '08 crash. Yeah. So that's the point he's getting at. And I mean, from a Keynesian perspective, just a little bit in terms of like, why do they think that? Because the deal is, especially when there's a financial crisis and interest rates are at rock bottom levels, they think that monetary policy becomes impotent. And it's what Keynes called a liquidity trap. See, the idea, like if interest rates are literally 0% at that level, money and government treasuries are virtually interchangeable, right? So the Fed comes in and says, we're going to do QE. We're going to buy, $1 trillion of treasuries, right? So we're going to create $1 trillion new dollars, and here you go. Oh, and we'll take the treasuries off your hands. Go get them, kids. And they want to argue on the margin that's actually not doing too much, because once the yield on T-bills is 0% or very close to it, how is a T-bill different from a $100 bill?
Yeah.
You're just kind of doing an asset swap that's not really doing much. So that's the claim they're making. Whereas mailing checks to people, like the Biden administration wasn't buying, shares of people's homes for $2,000. No, they were just mailing checks and saying, go do this. You see the difference? If what you're trying to do is goose spending, which is what Keynesians think you need to do, that's why they think just mailing checks to people will will boost aggregate demand more than doing an asset swap when interest rates on safe assets are virtually zero.
Gotcha. Good stuff. All right. My next clip is about inflation, and I'm going to act childish again because I'm so annoyed that it's not defined as an increase in the quantity of money anymore. This is Wray responding right after you said something about the powers that be being wrong about quote unquote transitory inflation. And then he says this, you both get to talking about how the trouble in the Middle East and oil is going to impact inflation. And then he says something else really weird about inflation I want to ask you about. Here we go.
Let's go and talk a little bit about the thing that is unfortunately taking too much of our attention right now, and that's the Iran-U.S.-Israel war. And over the last little while, oil has rallied 50%. I think, though, well, it's kind of debatable in terms of where oil is going to end up. But I think that even we could agree, even if tensions subside at this point, it looks like oil is going to be higher in the coming year. And if we look at the market's already taken like 1 year forward inflation swaps, and they've rallied from 2.25 to 3.25, like meaning that the market is expecting a lot more inflation in the coming year. It's also gone, and recently in the last 2 weeks, it's taken the implied year-end Fed funds rate, and it's taken it from 3% to 3.60, meaning that there was almost 3 cuts taken out of the policy. So my question, I'm going to give you 2 questions. What will be the effects of higher oil prices on the economy, and what will be the likely policy response? And I'll start with you, Randy.
Okay. Let me just say that I think that both Powell and Kelton were right. The inflation was transitory. It started coming down, and it started coming down. It was not the Fed raising interest rates, because the Fed raised interest rates, and 3 months later, inflation was down to about 3%. And nobody, not even the most committed monetarist, believes the monetary policy worked the 3-month lag. Inflation was transitory. It was coming down. Will we ever get down to zero again? I think not. I think that we had a special period. It was a very long period of almost a quarter of a century with near zero inflation. And it had to do with billions of workers coming into the global markets, China and India. That's what got inflation down to zero.
So inflation is perfectly normal and natural, and the only thing that could get it to not exist is billions of people entering the global economy. That just, I don't know, that didn't make much sense to me. I hate the way we talk about inflation these days. What did you think about that whole section?
Okay, so Stephanie Kelton said something like, so she'd been going around saying, yeah, it's transitory. In the summer of 2021, she was on, CNBC or something, and because this is when consumer price inflation was picking up, and like, how's this going? And she's like, oh no, and it rose by more than another percentage point after she said that. Off the top of my head, I don't remember, but it kept going up. Like even Krugman said, oh yeah, I was wrong about this at some point. Then later he backtracked and said, no, it turns out I was right. But there was a point at which the people who kept poo-pooing it and saying, no, don't listen to, the monetary hawks. This has nothing to do with what the Fed's doing. Supply chains, transitory, don't worry. And CPI just kept going higher and higher. And eventually, more of them threw in the towel and said, okay, yeah, maybe the Fed should raise rates. So anyway, and there, if you were just listening to what Randall Wray said, you would think that, oh yeah, surely empirically there's no, this argument that the Fed raising rates had something to do with inflation coming down. Look, this chart, the dotted green line is the federal funds rate, and the blue is the percent, the 12-month rise in consumer price index. Okay, so it's kind of like what the inflation rate is, the way the public talks. Mm-hmm. And so you can see, and here here's 2020, and you can see the green line drops all the way down to zero, right? That the Fed cuts in, the federal funds rate down to zero, and you can see, and that's when prices start rising rapidly, and it gets up to here, it breaks, the peak here, it was about 9% in June of 2022. Okay, and so you can see interest rates went to zero, and all of a sudden CPI goes way up, and then you can see here they start raising, that's the green going up, and then boom, this comes way down.
Yep.
And Wray is saying the notion that Federal Reserve policy had anything to do with CPI is crazy. And guys will say, what would the graph have to look like for us to think that no, it did have something to do with it? And he's quibbling about it. But basically, if you caught what he said something like, his argument was basically, well, no, it responded so quickly, like nobody thinks monetary policy has that much to do with inflation, and it's like, okay, that's kind of it'd be like, I don't know, somebody has cancer and then you get chemo and then you're totally cancer free. And they're like, no, that had nothing to do with it. Even the most aggressive supporters of chemo don't think it would work that quickly. anyway, maybe that's a silly analogy, but that's what he was saying there. He wasn't saying there was no connection. He was saying it apparently works so quickly that can't be what happened. So, all right. So there's that element, to all that. Am I answering? I know I kind of meandered there. Am I answering your question, or do you still need me to say?
I think that was great. There were like three different things. That was one of them. The other is, oil causes inflation to rise because oil is the cause of a bunch of other things being expensive, and I hate that.
I hate stuff like that.
And then what about the extra billions of people entering the economy? And that's the only way we could get zero inflation is if we got invaded from Mars and they all joined the economy. What is he even talking about?
All right, let's deal with the oil one first. So it is true that if, other things, you have to disentangle like one-shot increases in the price of certain things versus everything becoming more expensive. So yes, other things equal, if, I don't know, some vandals go around and they burn down half the houses, housing would be more expensive. But if the supply of dollars, the quantity of dollars in existence didn't change, then yeah, you would think that people spending more on houses means there's less to spend on other things. And, you could tell a story where, no, it doesn't fully offset and, including the price of shelter services in the CPI basket, CPI rises because the kids burned down half the houses. Okay, but that still would just be a one-shot thing. Like once it wouldn't explain why CPI rising at 4% year after year instead of only rising at 2%, unless people just keep progressively burning more and more houses, right? So I'm just saying these one-shot things like, oil's price spikes or, Putin invades and what. Yeah, that could at best explain a one-shot adjustment in the level. It wouldn't explain the trend. Okay, so that's how I would deal with that. And then the population. So I think what he's getting at is if you look empirically at like when did it seem that we had the so-called Great Moderation, price inflation was a big deal in the late 70s and early 80s. And then it seemed like, we kind of had a tranquil period, and particularly like in the late 90s up until the financial crisis and even beyond, people weren't worried about consumer price inflation. That wasn't a big deal. And then now all of a sudden it is a big deal with COVID, at this point, but there was that long stretch. So I think what his argument was, Adam, is that it's not, the Federal Reserve became more responsible or whatever. Like, no, the monetarists, they don't know what they're talking about. And certainly, I don't trust these people, these tight money hawks, because they're just real stingy and they want, break the back of the workers. And as long as, let's just make it so wages don't rise, that's kind of like the thing. So I think they have an ideological reason to not want monetary policy to be the thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think what he's saying is, the reason CPI inflation wasn't a big deal for that long stretch was this also coincided with globalization, bringing China in, World Trade Organization, most favored nation status, blah, 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 all this stuff that like an Orrin Cass hates. And so I think that's partly what he was getting at. So it's not that the global population rising per se, that's not what he meant. I think he's saying like bringing the rest of the world into like the U.S. economic orbit, real simply, like, how can Walmart can keep prices low because they can get cheap imports from China? Like that's one way of looking at it.
I got you. So, and that's never going to happen again. And so that's why we'll never have no inflation, because obviously it's insane to think that central banks would just quit inflating the money supply. We don't even need to list that as a possible way for inflation to go to zero.
I would agree with you, but in his framework, I think he doesn't think central banks had that much to do with it. So
interesting. All right, I only have one more clip for you. Right. You had told a story about you considering loaning $100 to your neighbor. You might think twice if the only way he was going to pay you back is by robbing you first. Mm-hmm. And so he responded thusly, and his MMT horns came out, and it's interesting.
The government doesn't spend tax revenue in the same way that I spend my wages. Okay? What they do is they use their account at the central bank in order to make the payment. And as Bernanke was saying in his proposal, you know what? The central bank can always credit their account. Now, Congress should decide how much the central bank can credit to the Treasury's account because they have the power of the purse. And then all the spending takes the form of, in the terminology Bob is using, of printing money, but it's using this account at the central bank to make the payment. All government spending takes the same form. There's not this special category of, oh, let's print money, or, oh, let's use tax revenue. No, it all is just running down the deposit account at the central bank, and treasuries have a variety of ways to fill up that account. Bernanke says, well, the central bank can just credit it to their account, and then they can go ahead and cut the checks.
When you think about it, it's not even costly for the taxpayer or the resource consumer of a particular polity. They can just credit the account, and that's where the stuff comes from.
You know, it's what occurred to me this reading of or watching of it is when they're saying, oh, and Bob's thinking that they're spending money, and you know, giving me a Mickey Mouse voice or something. But what he was getting at there was, like, Bob's drawing this arbitrary distinction between fiscal and monetary policy. And I was like, didn't you 10 minutes ago, Randy, just use that to explain the difference between why, you know, this Obama QE didn't work, but the COVID checks did? That, you know, he was making a distinction between monetary and fiscal. So anyway, what's going on there? I won't go through it in painstaking detail. I'll refer people in my review of Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, and so I'll link to it in the show notes page. I go through this pretty carefully, but it's ironic that the MMTers, like, their number one claim is, hey, we're not ideological. We're not advocating anything. We're just explaining how the world works. It's you Austrians who are whining about, oh, but I want it to be this way and it's not. You know, we're just telling you how the world is. And yet when he just went through there and is insisting that this is how government spending, they're just wrong. That's not how it works, right? It is not the case that if the Treasury wants fighter jets, they just inform the Fed to put money into the checking account balances of Lockheed Martin or whoever. That's not the case. If the Treasury doesn't have enough money in its checking account with the Fed will say no. And it's not just their discretion, it's illegal. Like, the Congress passed a rule in the early 80s saying that the Treasury cannot overdraft, you know, its reserve account with the Fed. All right. Now they can come back and say, well, yeah, but that's a thing, like Congress could just pass a law relaxing that. Well, right, but Congress could pass a law saying anytime Robert Murphy writes a check, the bank should cash it. It's good. They could do that in our system. It's not like, you know, the laws of physics would be violated. So now, I grant you, it's more likely they would relax the constraint on the Treasury than on me, but I'm saying there's nothing financially or economically distinct about it. Okay, so I'm just saying, when he just so calmly tells you, no, this is how actually it works, it's not true. That's just not the case. That what has to happen, the Treasury has to first have the money before they can spend it. And what's ironic is, right now, I'm allowed to overdraft my account with my bank. They'll cover me for whereas technically the Treasury is not allowed to. So there's a sense in which I can spend more liberally than the Treasury can, all right, in that narrow sense, in terms of what he's saying, the way the world works right now. So again, to be clear, right now, the way it works, if the federal government wants to spend money, they need to have incoming tax receipts or they need to issue bonds. And that's it. They need to have the money first before they can't just spend it and then have the Fed ex post create the money to fill the gap. Now, it's kind of a shell game, right? Like, that's superficially what happens, but behind the scenes, what can happen is that the Treasury issues bonds and then the Fed makes it known, oh, some private dealer, you know, you give money to the Treasury and get bonds from them, and then we, the Fed, in an open market operation, will create reserves out of thin air, credit them to your account, and buy those treasuries from you, and we're going to do a round of QE or whatever. So that kind of feels, so indirectly it's, you know, the Fed monetizing the debt. But I'm just saying, strictly speaking, mechanically, what he said is not true. All right.
Right.
And so
he was trying to take the edge off your point that government spending hurts the taxpayer. I mean, he's like, you expect his next sentence to be, so really, when you think about it, we shouldn't even have an IRS because that's not even where government gets the money. So, like,
yeah,
I mean, it seemed like a rhetorical device. Yeah.
Right. I don't remember rhetorically what point he was making there. Like in other words, what I had said that made him say that.
Your thing about the $100.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah. So so the back and forth there was, he had made the point that, if you just understand accounting and sectoral balances, and, you know, again, this isn't ideology, folks. This is just numbers, man. This is math. Sorry if arithmetic bothers you. To his credit, Randy wasn't laying it on thick with that, but clearly, like, I've encountered that a ton of times, right, in terms of dealing with MMTers. But he was saying that, you know, everyone's worried about government deficits and stuff, but I mean, what do you guys want? If the government, we can prove it mathematically, that if the government runs a deficit, then the private sector, you know, has a financial surplus. And that if the government were to foolishly run a balanced budget, then how the heck is the private sector supposed to have a surplus anymore? And so that's where I, you know, said, yes, when you understand the terms, whenever the accounting per se is correct. But again, that would be, to me, it's confusing. Like, it's making the word surplus sound benign and good, actually, when in this setting, it's not. It loses it, you know, if we sell a bunch of jet engines to foreigners and they owe us money, and now we have bonds issued by them, that's a valid component of our national wealth, because how are they going to pay? They're going to have to do something productive to come up with the means to pay us. Mm-hmm. Whereas if the government gives a bunch of checks to senior citizens through Social Security and floats bonds, and then the Fed monetizes it, or we just directly lend money to the Treasury, and then now we say, we're that much wealthier because we're sitting on all these Treasury securities. And you say, well, how are they going to pay you? And it means down the road, they're just going to tax it from you and then say, here you go. That's where I was saying, folks, that if a guy down the street owes me $100 and he comes and sticks a gun in my belly and robs me, I give him $100 and then he hands it right back to me and says, now we're square. That's, if I know that's what's going to happen, then me holding the IOU from him the week before doesn't mean as much as if I have an IOU from a productive member of society who's going to go mow lawns to get the money to pay me. And so that's the point, that I had been making. And then that's when he came up with this thing to say, to me, it was almost a non sequitur, even on its own terms. Like, I don't know how what he just said there refutes my point, but in any event, that's, rhetorically, he thought he was somehow knocking down that point that I made. I think what he was getting at is, you Austrians don't like deficit spending or whatever, but I mean, it's not this qualitatively different thing, right? Like, you guys are trying to say, government taxation and spending is what it is, and maybe if you need to do it for valid reasons, but don't have the money printer come in and get involved because that's just dirty. When no, the whole thing is like that. You can't. I think that's the point he was trying to make, and I want to say, no, that's clearly not true, right? Like, everybody agrees. Back when there was a gold, well, it's not that they agree. Back when gold and silver coins were the money, like, clearly then, yes, literally, the government could only spend what it first took in tax revenue.
Yeah.
And then, when they, used jail threats and fines to get everyone to turn their gold in and have pieces of paper, it was removed from that and so on down the road. And you do have to think one step ahead when Friedman is still saying, whatever the government gets, it just took from you, that, the pieces of paper come, but ultimately it's the real resources, right? Like, that's why the Zimbabwe government couldn't field a military that could defeat the United States. You say, because they were afraid to spend money, like they were afraid to run in the printing press. No, it's because they didn't have the real resources. So ultimately, and again, it's weird. The MMTers agree with that ultimately the constraint on government spending is real resources. And so there again, I'm going to say we're all kind of saying the same thing. It's just we have a different, approach of attack or something to the issue. But ultimately, if the government is going to build a bunch of tanks and have 10 million people in the military and whatever, Those are real resources that get siphoned away from the private sector. And don't think they're doing you a favor by building a bridge or a sports stadium and saying, thank you, it was a gift from the heavens. No, it wasn't.
Exactly. That's what the whole point is, just to obfuscate the truth, that it's not a gift from the heavens. Anytime I hear quantitative easing or increasing the money supply, I picture the Union Army marching in and just taking stuff from us, because that's what they're doing, right? They're just like a counterfeiter would. You're coming along and just taking stuff, and
they're
not
going to
giving
take
us
your
any...
slaves that you paid good. You paid.
I did say the Union Army, right? It could have been the Confederate Army coming rolling up. It doesn't matter. But yeah, that's how I think of it. They're just coming along and taking our stuff, and then you got these guys in suits saying that's not really what's happening. It's just we're doing fiscal policy and monetary policy.
Yeah. And ironically, I guess I'm lamenting it, is they could come back and say, yeah, you're assuming full employment.
Right.
You know what I mean? And then that's why I want to debate the job guarantees. Okay, right. So explain to me how the federal government printing money and saying anybody who wants a job will give you a job, like that, cures the slack in the labor market. In other words, theoretically, they could come up with a story in which there's resources that would remain idle, but for, government deficit spending or whatever. And so I'm happy to move, to argue on that terrain too. And we didn't get to that. So, or we didn't get to that. We didn't get to it either, but.
We didn't get to that thing. This was great, Bob. Do you have any closing remarks about any of the stuff we've talked about?
I think so I encourage people to watch the whole thing, the ZeroHedge debate. It was like, an hour and 20 minutes, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
It wasn't too bad. I think the host did a great job. Like I liked the format. In other words, we weren't debating each other. He was just throwing out stuff and we got to respond. There were a few things there. I was giving you a chance and you covered one of them, but there was a few others, Adam, that Randy said something and I didn't have time to respond, or I had to, pick my battles. And so folks, on the Bob Murphy Show, I'll do my next solo episode. I'll follow some of them, but you got to watch the ZeroHedge thing first to know the context. So you got to do that. You got to do your homework.
Got to do your homework. All right. Well, on the way out the door, I'd like to encourage people to go to my Substack. You can find that at HamanNature.com, HAMAN nature.com. Bob, just in case people don't see you in every corner where you reside of the interwebs, where do you like to send people?
I think today I'm going to point people my Twitter account. I've just been lighting it up over there. So it's Bob Murphy Econ is my handle. Is that what the kids are saying these days? And I go there. It's good stuff. A lot of zingers lately.
Yep, you're on fire. All right, thanks again, Bob, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next time.
So long, folks.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.